My name's Dwight Atkinson. I'm the director of the English Applied Linguistics program in the English department at the University of Arizona. And we're happy to co-sponsor this event today, this opening of this very interesting, sort of, for me, a novel new kind of conference. The conference will go on over the week online, and then next week will culminate in a Saturday, full-day Saturday session, in which there will be, I believe, 2 keynote speakers and a full day of events. So today it gives me great pleasure to introduce to you the English department's own Shelley Staples. Shelley is a new member of our department, kind of a dream come true as we have been trying to rebuild the English Applied Linguistics program at UA over the past few years. She is, in fact, we believe, the last remaining piece of the puzzle. Okay? Let me tell you just a little bit about Shelley as I know her. And this may be an older person's reminiscence. I'll try to keep it short. But I was a graduate student at the University of Southern California some time ago. And the professor I worked closely with there, not my formal advisor, but was Douglas Biber, a great pioneer corpus linguist. Doug went off, came to Arizona, Northern Arizona University, and I went off and went to Alabama and Japan and Indiana and some other places. But I came back a few years ago, visited Northern Arizona, and while I was there, Doug said to me, sort of whispered in my ear, he says, "We have the greatest graduate student in the history of," I don't remember the rest, but it was a very, very, very sparkling recommendation. And I know Doug rather well. He's not a man who says things like this when he doesn't mean it. So I was sort of, my eyes lit up, and there sitting across from me at the table was Shelley. A year later, we hired Shelley at Purdue University, where I was then teaching, and I left. And then I think a year and a half later, we hired her at the University of Arizona, where I'm very happy now to be her colleague. Shelley's work is quite stunning in its use of corpus linguistic methodologies to look at different areas of language use. Okay? Her dissertation is on nurse-patient or health caregiver-patient discourse, and she uses a wide variety of methodologies. So I know she's going to talk today about interdisciplinarity, and Shelley is a true practitioner of what is the right nominalization? Interdisciplinarityness. No, interdisciplinarity. No, something like that. She's a true interdisciplinarian, and she's going to talk today about her experience. Applied linguistics is an interdisciplinary field. SLAT, as we constructed here at UA, is a highly interdisciplinary endeavor. So I think what Shelley will have to tell us today will be very useful, and welcome to your ears. So welcome. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dwight. That was a very generous introduction, and I'm really happy to be here. I'm happy to see so many familiar faces and new faces. So today I'm going to be talking about a project I've been working on. It's very much a work in progress, so I'm going to be talking a lot about process, but I'm hoping that you'll be able to find something that's relevant to the kind of work that you do, and maybe even more specifically to the work that you are engaging in your research, teaching, and also another piece that I'm bringing in, which is graduate student mentoring. So first of all, Let's make sure this is working. There we go. There's our crow. Okay. So the title of this project is Corpus and Repository of Writing. And so we have the acronym CROW. This project was started at Purdue, where I was, where Dwight introduced me. I was a professor at Purdue for a couple of years and started this project there. But thankfully, it's continuing as I move to University of Arizona and hopefully expanding as well. So it's an interdisciplinary project that we have formed across the two of the units in the English department there, Applied Linguistics or Second Language Studies, and the Rhetoric and Composition program. And we're focusing on the use of technology to enhance teaching, research, and mentoring practices in first-year writing. So this is our team. We have quite a big team. This is the CROW team at Purdue. So first, I have my colleague, Bradley Belcher. He's the director of the writing program there, an associate professor of rhetoric and composition. And then you can see we have about 10 graduate students and 1 undergraduate student who's working with us. The people that I've shown here with their pictures are people that you're going to hear from later in the presentation. And as you can see, we have a fairly equal representation from our Second Language Studies program and our Rhetoric and Composition program. So I also want to recognize a couple of other graduate students that actually approached me before I even started working at Purdue and were interested in this project. They've since moved on, but they'll come up as I tell our story a little bit. So, to talk a little bit about the background and history, first of all, just thinking about the fields of applied linguistics and more specifically corpus linguistics, where I come from. We're interested in using digital technology and in language teaching, and in this case, we're particularly interested in the teaching of writing and especially second language writing. We're interested a lot of times in corpus linguistics and in CALL also more generally looking at the impact of using technology on language development. And one of our projects that I'll talk about does focus on that. But I think there's a lot of overlap as well between the disciplines of applied linguistics and rhetoric and composition. And one of the areas that I'll focus on later is specifically second language writing. But I think there's a number of other things that come out between corpus linguistics and rhetoric and composition too. So thinking about investigating rhetorical moves and using corpora to inform pedagogy, and particularly in the creation of tools. And this is where we really found our overlaps, at least to start with. I also want to kind of narrow down from the area of rhetoric and composition and say that my collaborator is really involved in technical communication that has done a lot of work in the area of digital literacy and working in use of digital technology in the teaching of writing. And there are of course differences, and we'll see more of those as the presentation goes on, but really this focus on the creation of digital products, particularly websites, is an area where we saw overlap. And also thinking about rhetorical strategies for navigating digital writing. Sure. Is that better? Okay, sorry. Okay, so where did this project start? I think I moved a little bit too far. Again, I wanted to really highlight the fact that this came from a number of graduate student initiatives at Purdue. The 2 graduate students that I mentioned were really interested in corpus building and repository building, and they really saw a need for collaboration within their cohort and also within the department as a whole. We got involved really by participating in interdisciplinary spaces, and these were spaces that had been developed before I arrived, but one of them that was especially important was a technology initiatives working group. So again, here we have a group that's interested in technology and teaching, and particularly the teaching of writing. And we were able to come together and talk about some of the projects that we were interested in doing. We shared the corpus that I'll talk about here in a minute with them, with members of this group. And this was a group that was composed of both students and faculty from rhetoric and composition and from second language studies. So we saw that we had a lot of shared interests and goals. The need for online resources for teachers, and particularly focusing on teacher training and pedagogical applications of the technology. We also had some research interests that overlapped, and particularly this was from Dr. Dilger and I had some shared interests in first year and also discipline-specific writing. And we also shared a desire to mentor graduate and undergraduate students. So this really brought us together. Just to kind of lay this out a little bit more, we had a couple of projects that started before I joined the team, one of which was the Collaborative Online Instructors Network. This was a graduate student project, predominantly run by rhetoric and composition graduate students that were working in the writing program. They got a grant and they developed a website, but unfortunately it faded away. And then the other collaborative network that was developed was actually something that Scott and Hee-Jung, that I mentioned earlier, developed as part of a rhetoric and composition course at Purdue. And they really envisioned having both this corpus and repository together as a resource, particularly for research for graduate students, because they saw a lot of members of their cohort interested in second language writing and doing research with it, but everyone was gathering their data on their own and not really talking about what they were doing with each other. So after I arrived at Purdue, we started building the Purdue Second Language Writing Corpus, and I'll talk more about that in a minute. But really, so this was my area of expertise, the corpus building. However, once I started joining the Technology Initiative Working Group and talking with Bradley and others in the rhetoric and composition program, we saw that we had these shared goals and decided to embark on CROW. So here are the goals that we've come up with after, so this project actually started in 2015 in earnest, fall of 2015. And so we have goals of building a corpus and repository of student writing, and also, so the repository will include pedagogical artifacts such as syllabi, activities, and assignments. We also want to support research and professional development, which showcase the potential of interdisciplinary work and collaborative work. And so these were all things that we kind of talked about. We developed these goals iteratively within our research team, and also through various drafting of documents. Another thing that we are interested in doing, and so this is really where we're moving to the online version of the corpus and the repository, is thinking about how we can provide multiple interfaces which support multiple approaches towards research and professional development. Because of course, the students and faculty and others, and even administrators who would be using this tool, would have different interests and focuses. So we also wanted to have a database which allowed contributors and researchers to look at the intersections between the corpus and the repository. So this isn't something that's often included in corpus work. Usually we're thinking about the texts themselves, but and of course, not that context isn't important, but that doesn't always get brought into the corpus work. So this was definitely something that was brought in through this interdisciplinary collaboration. We also wanted instructors and researchers to be able to share data, and so both instructors for professional development, being able to share syllabi, lesson plans, and also to look at each other's student writing, but also to be able to have other researchers use our database, and eventually, hopefully, to have other researchers add to this database so that we can have examples of student writing across institutions. So thinking about developing these goals, it really, again, happened over time. It required this time spent together in interdisciplinary spaces, particularly in our research group, but also when we needed to present our ideas to outsiders. So when we were meeting with potential collaborators, particularly people in IT and librarians, thinking about how we were articulating our project to them who were not within either of our disciplines, and also representing the goals that we had, both you know, as a team and also our individual interests. And I really feel like that a lot of this came about through having these external sources to promote the development of goals. So we started with a call for participation in which we asked graduate students to join our research group. And then we've been working on grant proposals, we've been going to conferences, and so all of this has really contributed to our development of these goals. Okay, so now I want to talk about infrastructure, which really brings us to, I think, the place that we've been able to develop more of our interdisciplinarity in this project. So when we think about infrastructure from a corpus approach, I am always thinking about the corpus as a data set. That's very different from a lot of ways that people approach repositories or other types of archives. And so corpus, generally you have some research questions in mind when you're developing the corpus. They may not be specific, but some research questions. Also thinking about the representativeness of the corpus. So when we are thinking about developing this second language writing corpus at Purdue, we wanted to be able to represent the students that were in the first year writing program. We wanted to make sure that we had representation from the different assignments or genres that they were producing in the class. And we also thought about, you know, things like their first language background and other aspects that would speak to representativeness. So this came through in terms of also recording metadata, and this comes through actually on the text in the corpus, where we want to connect that information to the text themselves. You know, kind of practical things like being able to process the text into the machine readable format. Now this is easy when you have just text, but when you're talking about images, which, you know, more and more of our first year writing programs are multimodal in terms of the kinds of assignments that they're asking students to do. So that's a challenge that we're still working on. And then where are we going to store the text? So first we made this available as an offline database. It still is offline, it's not online yet. But even that requires working with other people at the institution, meeting with IT to determine where to store the data. We need to think about security, and we also wanted access for the teachers and other graduate students and faculty researchers. We also need to develop processes for de-identifying texts. So this is the corpus as it is now. So we've been collecting for actually 4 semesters. So I started this when in 2014. And you can see there's 5 assignments that are represented in the corpus. These are the assignments that the students produce in the first year writing course for international students, and it's just a 1-semester course there. And so we have about 6 million words at this point, so a pretty decent sized data set. This is an example of a text just to show you what I was talking about in terms of the metadata being there with the text. And this allows us to then look at different aspects of the student's background in relation to the writing that they're producing. So then we start to think about infrastructure. So I think this is something that really has pushed me beyond my thinking in terms of infrastructure, is actually an idea, is a more hermeneutic and dialectic idea of infrastructure, which comes from the scholarship in technical communication. So Susan Lee Starr wrote The Ethnography of Infrastructure and talks about infrastructure as something that shapes and is shaped by the conventions of a community. It takes on transparency by plugging into other institutions and tools in a standardized fashion, so thinking about all of these networks that we're building within our institution and outside of our institution, and it becomes most visible when it breaks. So it's not something that we really think about a lot, and especially I think as a corpus linguist, you know, until I started embarking on this kind of a project, it's not something that was part of my training for sure. So this is kind of a messy map of, of the space that we're working in, the infrastructure that we're trying to build. When we think about the corpus of student writing, the repository of pedagogical artifacts, our different goals that we have in research, pedagogy, and professional development, the different users that we imagine to access this corpus and repository, and then also all of the other institutional elements that we need to interact with in order to make this project happen, and especially funding, right? So one of the things that I mentioned was the Collaborative Online Instructors Network, and how it was a project that was started by graduate students as part of a need for this idea of sharing pedagogical materials across the program, but unfortunately it was not sustainable. And a lot of that had to do with funding, but it also had to do with people leaving and graduating and getting jobs, which is great, we like that. But there are other projects that are in similar kinds of situations, even really big, well-known projects. So there's the Michigan Corpus of Upper Level Student Papers, which some of you may be familiar with. And I have heard from Ute Romer that there is going to be a more secure home for MyCusp soon. But there's no one, you know, they lost their funding structure basically at University of Michigan in order to support this project, so they're not able to continue to advance that project at this point in time. And then probably anybody who knows what a corpus is is familiar with the BYU corpus, especially COCA, Corpus of Contemporary American English. And this is really spearheaded, though, by one man, Mark Davies, and he will retire. You've probably gotten messages now from BYU to contribute. So they're starting to think about the sustainability issue, but it definitely is something that we need to think about as we're working on these projects. So in trying to tackle this issue, we thought of 5 key things that we wanted to focus on, including, I've already kind of talked about building partnerships, building the sustainability into the design life cycle. So actually thinking about from the beginning that we wanted this to be an interinstitutional collaboration even before I left and came here. And also thinking about all the people that we could work with who were working on similar projects. Within our team itself, we really work on building diverse and iterative teams. We are documenting our work processes, which helped me to put together this presentation today. And other things that we're building into this include using models for user-centered design and sharing our work in progress, just as I am now. So in thinking about partnerships, I already kind of mentioned some of these intra-institutional partners that we've been working with. Also, a lot of events like this is a great place to meet with potential intra-institutional partners. And the larger framework of digital humanities, I think, is something else that we can tap into. We're also working on meeting with inter-institutional partners, so looking for other faculty at other institutions who are trying to solve some of the same issues that we are and have experience in doing so. And then I have been talking to some of you and hope to be also adding partners here at U of A. So in terms of these diverse iterative teams, I have here on the left a screenshot of some meeting notes that we had in Google Docs from our first meeting this semester, where we were kind of thinking about what we wanted to focus on for the semester. And as we talked through the different projects and who would be on what teams, we really were very conscious of trying to include students from both of the different backgrounds on each team, but also providing the grad students with opportunities for leadership. So kind of thinking about, you know, what their strengths were, what their interests were, and of course, having them involved in this decision-making process. So it allows the students to interact in different ways on different types of projects. So some of them will be more expert on certain aspects, and some will be more expert on others. So we started off just using Google Drive. Many of us use Google Docs to organize our work. And we still continue to do that. It's a really good collaborative space. I was not a huge supporter when I first started this project, but I have become one. But we also have found that we needed something a little bit more sophisticated to keep track of our workflow, and also to make notes. And if you're not already using Basecamp, they did not, you know, provide me with any funding to say this, but it is a good platform. There are other ones out there, but basically the idea is that we're able to break things up into our different projects, assign to-dos to our smaller teams within our larger research team, keep track of where we are, because now we're doing lots of different things, and also to start to map out, on the far right is some of our initial images of prototyping for what the online interface might look like. And this is our blog, so please come join us and see what we're doing. But it's also it's a place where obviously we can make our workflow more public, but it also is a way for us to keep track of what we've been doing and where we've been. So in addition to the work on infrastructure, I also really found transformative, I guess for me, the work that has been done on user-centered design. And again, this is something that wasn't really part of my background and training, but which my colleague in technical communication was able to bring into our project. So thinking about how we can help users to understand complex information technologies, both in terms of creating and using them. And so thinking of these networks and also our different user groups in a much more complex way. And so some of that, in a practical way, is done through running what we call environmental scans. So basically we're looking at different websites that have already been constructed, both from the corpus and repository perspective, and reporting about the pros and cons of these projects. And we also have worked on preparing personas and scenarios. So these are, you know, beyond the idea, okay, we know we're going to have students, we're going to have teachers, and we're going to have researchers, but really trying to imagine who our users are. So for the environmental scans, we looked at some of the more famous websites, and also for Corpus, and also for repository. And you know, thinking about things like audience purpose, the navigation, how easy it was to get help if you needed to, and also the styling and design. So we all think that Lex Tutor, if you know that website, needs a little bit of an update. So we had fun looking at that site. Okay, so this is my cusp, just an example of basically going through, and this was again one of our teams within our larger research team, an interdisciplinary team that went through and basically did this environmental scan for us so that we could use this to draw on to build our own website. And then for just an example of the personas and scenarios, so thinking about and this can get a lot more detail, but just for an example, we think about, you know, who some of the users might be, creating a name for them, giving them an identity, you know, so they might be a first-year international graduate student teaching composition, and what are they looking for? Well, they're looking for teaching resources on research methods for first-year composition. So thinking about how we can speak to these different personas and scenarios in our online interface. So I think, you know, I've definitely had my mind expanded in terms of thinking about what, you know, what might be a tool to one person is actually an entire area of study for another person. And that certainly comes up with corpus linguistics as well. But having these multiple levels of expertise to help us address these different aspects of the project really allowed us to move forward in ways that were new and different, I think. And of course, having these shared goals was extremely important and motivating. And being able to participate in these spaces gave us opportunities to learn from each other in ways that helped to advance this project. Okay, so I'm going to talk a little bit about research. How am I doing on time? Okay, so I want to point out, first of all, that as Dwight said, that applied linguistics, and specifically the field of second language writing, is already interdisciplinary. So I think that a lot of times, so in both applied linguistics and rhetoric and composition are interdisciplinary fields. But I think sometimes we don't necessarily call attention to this interdisciplinarity. Actually, one of our students made a comment about, and I'll share it a little bit later, about being able to see where the literature comes from that we're drawing on is really important. So thinking about applied linguistics, you know, these are generalizations, certainly not true for everybody, but empirical research methods are definitely very important. In composition studies, certainly those methods are used, but they're also using more hermeneutic and dialectic research methods. But there's a lot of similarities, and so I think this pragmatic pursuit that we have across fields has really drawn us into this project. So Silva and Leckie, in the same article from 2004, call upon us to use multimodal methodology, so trying to bring together these different perspectives on research and merging theory and practice and perform interdisciplinary work. So we are hopeful that Crow takes up these challenges, bringing together these two fields, enhancing the study of student writing, performing mixed methods research, and developing pedagogy grounded in empirical research. So one of the things that we decided to do is embark on a research project together. And I'd already been doing some research with, on the corpus from, you know, my corpus-based perspective, and I'll talk about that in just a minute. But we also wanted to think about how we could do a research project together. So the first thing that we talked about were our shared interests and also shared antecedents, and this kind of came out through John Swales. He's a figure that we can both kind of draw on and agree we think is a wonderful researcher and human being. So, so this really helped us to kind of think about what we had in common and where our research might go. So we, through this, we had the graduate students participate in this process of kind of trying to narrow down what our research focus was going to be. We again presented them with, we presented them with a number of possible options for research projects and had them comment on that. We decided to focus on citation practices in first-year writing. So this was something that we found literature from both of our fields. So the Citation project is a body of work by Jameson and Howard. And we also, and there's certainly a fair amount of research on this in applied linguistics as well. We had already been doing research in our research team that extends corpus linguistics into first-year writing. So we'd been working with more micro features, reporting verbs, which are things like argue, show, find, and think. And we also wanted to have an opportunity to connect the corpus and repository. So we decided on a research question of how do citation practices change based on pedagogical artifacts. So this is just kind of, let me show you an overview of the research that we've been doing. So first of all, we had a descriptive study that was very much based in the corpus, had a pedagogical goal, but still was coming from a corpus-based approach. So we looked at semantic classes and rhetorical functions and reporting verbs. And then based on that, and this was done on the Purdue corpus, the Purdue Second Language Writing corpus, then based on the results of that study, we decided to do a classroom-based research project. So bringing the corpus into the classroom, looking at how if we could develop a workshop that would help students to improve their use of reporting verbs. And then finally, then we see that our work trying to bring together the corpus and repository is focused on this larger idea, this more macro idea of citation practice. So just a little bit about this research. For the descriptive study, we looked at 10 sections within the corpus, and this was the 4th assignment that they have in the course, the literature review assignment. Again, we looked at semantic classes and rhetorical functions. I'm just going to focus on the semantic classes in presenting a few of these results. And we compared our findings with some previous research. So here we can see a comparison between what the L2 writers in the Purdue Second Language Writing corpus we're doing with these reporting verbs. These are different semantic features. Agree is blue, show is orange, find is gray, and think is yellow. So in these we compared with a study by Eric Friginal, which he looked at published articles and also student papers from a writing class in which he was using corpus-based instruction. And so what we found was our student writers were actually using a lot more of these think verbs. It's not that surprising. If you teach first-year writing, you can think about students using a lot of these to both articulate their own arguments and also to connect with others' arguments as well. Another thing we wanted to look at is the variety of their use of these particular verbs. So we focused on, again, this is within the semantic category of argue. There are all these different verbs they could use, but we found that the students were really clinging to say, state, and talk about. So these were all the verbs that they were using predominantly in their writing. So from this, we decided to develop a workshop in which we would conduct some research, bringing some materials into the first-year writing courses. So we had 3 sections of the course that participated in this workshop, and basically we brought in examples from the corpus. We had the students do some inductive learning using those examples, and then we also had them apply it to revisions at the end of the workshop. It was a short workshop, it was only 45 minutes, so, but we did see some good results from it. So we had a control group, we used the corpus as a control group to compare, to see if it was just writing 2 drafts or whether there might be some impact of this instruction. So for the corpus-based instruction group, the ones that participated in the workshop, we did see some increase in variety So you can see that some of the verbs that they were choosing very frequently, like mention and especially talk about, so they used these less in their second drafts. So they seem to pick up on the idea of using some of these verbs that they were not using so frequently. We also talked about what we had seen in the corpus, how many of these verbs were used by the second language writers in similar courses to what they were taking. And then if we look at the control group, there were not many changes, actually. Some of these verbs we saw an increase in use, and particularly those verbs that were used very frequently were still used frequently. So it seems like there was some effect. So thinking about this research and how we were able to work as an interdisciplinary research team focusing on these research goals, we really focused on our pedagogical goals and the concerns that we had in terms of the classroom teaching in order to determine where we might want to focus in our projects. I think the research on infrastructure really informed our approaches to developing digital technology, and also there was space for us to have more disciplinary bound research and to converge at different points. So we have been presenting this research at a number of different conferences, and the one that I want to highlight here is the Computers and Writing Conference, because this was a conference that is run that I had never been to before, and but that my TechCom collaborator was very familiar with and introduced me to, and so we decided to present at this conference. So we had both of the faculty there. We had 2 students from Rhetoric and Composition and 1 student from SLS. We introduced Corpus Linguistics, so we divided up the tasks within the presentation to highlight where we saw our strengths. And so we were able to introduce Corpus Linguistics to this more Rhetoric and Composition audience. But also talk about some of the interdisciplinary research methods that we were embarking on. And of course, sustainable infrastructure. That was kind of the driving theme. So we also, as part of this, participated in a workshop on computational rhetorics, which is an emerging area within rhetoric and composition. And this was really insightful for me because they were approaching the issue of trying to identify aspects, rhetorical aspects in writing, but from definitely a different perspective. But they were using computational methods. So many of the same questions arose. So they were looking at, for example, hedging, which is something that corpus linguists have looked at a lot. But the methodology was not necessarily what was driving it. So this was where I was able to kind of take a step back as a corpus linguist and see, so how do I fit into this? Where does my expertise come in? Maybe help inform, but also thinking about the different focus that they had. They were focused more on outcomes. So they were interested in the end goal rather than as a corpus linguist. I'm like, okay, what do you count as a hedge? What kind of framework are you using? That didn't really matter so much. So I want to end with some graduate student comments because they've been actually a part of this whole presentation, but I'm going to bring them in more visibly now. And so one of the things that I actually had them do a very informal interview where I asked them to answer some questions. And so the graduate students that you saw pictured at the beginning of the presentation were involved in this. So this is from Michelle. She's a third-year PhD student in rhetoric and composition. And she talked about interdisciplinary spaces in a few different ways. I mentioned her comment earlier when I when I was talking about interdisciplinary research, that it's a part of applied linguistics and rhetoric and composition, but it's not always apparent where our research methods come from. And so she kind of talked about the fact that, as happens, I think, too, in applied linguistics, we use these different research methods, we borrow them, but we're not always aware of the history, and so that can become problematic. Also, something that we can work on interdisciplinarily is to share resources and infrastructure. I mean, she saw that as really, and it has been, a driving force of the project. It really it's where our shared goals really come out the most. And so we can collaborate really, really usefully. And she also talked about the ability to discuss some of the tensions that come up when you're working interdisciplinarily. And but that because we had this shared space and that we had a place for this, that this was a place that we could have these conversations that might reveal tensions, but would allow us to kind of talk through how we wanted to present our project. This is from Terrence. He's a second-year PhD student in second language studies, and this was definitely a theme that came out a lot in the reflections. Modesty and respect are important in interdisciplinary research, in an interdisciplinary research group. The more I work with people trained in different disciplines, especially people from different epistemological and methodological orientations, the humbler I feel I am and should be. So really focusing on this need for respect and for trying to understand where different team members come from. And he talked specifically about our project in trying to develop how we were going to go forward with the citation project, that there were different operationalizations of the idea of citation, and we kind of had to work through that as a team. Sherry is a fourth-year PhD student in rhetoric and composition, and she talked about needing to explain ideas in different ways and also having patience. So realizing that not everybody comes with the same background, and asking questions, talking through different tasks and different processes can be a really helpful way of tapping into and allowing, I think, some of this, allowing for there to be new discoveries. I think it's also important to not put labels on students and put labels and maybe on any member of an interdisciplinary team, because I think for a lot of the students, especially those from second language studies, they already saw themselves as interdisciplinary researchers. And actually that's why they joined the project, because they wanted to have this interaction between the two fields. And Ola, who's a third-year PhD student in second language study, pointed out that, she has this background in rhetoric and composition. She's continuing to build that in the PhD program too. But there would be some times when people would see her as an SLS person. She really didn't feel that was an accurate representation of her identity. And then also thinking beyond these disciplinary boundaries to individual identities. So a couple of the students brought out, the different strengths that the students bring to the program, the different kinds of interests, and so kind of trying to look beyond those categories. Okay, and then finally, just thinking about their reflections on. Okay, thank you. Yep, that's great. I'm wrapping up. Their reflections on technology and teaching. So Terrence brought out the fact that the project gave him a way to actually, put into practice some of what he had been learning and thinking about in his coursework. Hadi talked about, having these projects that link pedagogy to research was really inspiring to him, and he's going on and doing some research outside of the research team. And I thought this was really interesting. Ola talked about that de-identifying the corpus text, which requires a lot of time, and it's not always a very interesting process, but she considered this to be a pedagogical act. It was a time when she could actually look at these texts in more detail and be able to see what others were doing in their own, in different classes. Okay, and I think I'm just gonna skip to, whoops, I'm going the wrong way. Yeah, this is the last slide. So for the other students, I think it allowed them to focus on interests that they had outside of the project and see how, for Michelle, for example, this project could actually be a focus of research in and of itself. And then finally, a lot of them talked about seeing this as a way to prepare for their future roles as assistant professor, basically seeing how to participate in this kind of research group. And I will end with her comments. So thank you.
I'm the GA for Circle. I'd like to thank Dr. Staples again for presenting this evening. We'd like to open up the floor for about 10 minutes of questions. I'm going to be running around with a little lapel pin mic. This is so that our folks watching on the recorded video can hear, so you won't be able to hear anything. So please speak up, try to be loud, as I'm attempting to be loud so that you can hear. All right? Dr. Staples, whenever you're ready.
Yeah, great.
You're closer.
Thank you, Shelley. That was really interesting. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about disciplinarity and sustainability, and I'm particularly thinking about maybe the precarious position that some disciplines may be in an interdisciplinary project, and I'm thinking about it in terms of MyCus, in which actually much of the ESL support at University of Michigan actually moved to a different division in the university. And I'm just wondering if you could speak to that in terms of sustainability of this kind of project.
Yeah, so that's really interesting. Did it move into the writing program then? Yeah. So I'm familiar with that unit a bit. Actually, they were at the Computers and Writing conference, so I got introduced to them there. Yeah, so I think that this is a really good point. As we see that units are changing, merging, dissolving, I think that if we have interdisciplinary partners, then we also set ourselves up for continuing to have a presence and a purpose, because I think a lot of times we embark on research projects on our own. We have funding at the time, but that funding it can definitely go away. And also I think it's just as we move to a more interdisciplinary model within our universities, it's a way of engaging with that as well. Thank you.
Could you hear Chris's question? Is it coming through here? Is it coming through here? Okay. Yeah, I have a question that's sort of bubbling up from my id, so it might come out quite weird. We'll see. But I worry sometimes about, I don't know what to call it. I love the happy side of interdisciplinarity. I read very little, I think, in my field these days, and very much out in other fields that have nothing officially to do with applied linguistics. But I worry about predatory interdisciplinarity, meaning when two groups from different thought styles come together, and I'll just refer to second language writing. We have good ideas. We have methods for actually doing stuff.
Exactly.
And they seem to come into our territory to take the money and run.
Yeah.
Now, I'm not making any accusations. Let's see, could I make an accusation? I mean, I think, for example, of second language acquisition studies in second language writing these days, sort of trying to remake the field into written corrective feedback. Maybe that's their methodology. Or I think of translingualism in rhetoric and composition, which takes some of our stuff.
Yeah.
I'm sorry to put it in us and them, but there's a feeling here. And then sort of runs with it and turns it into something that then reflects badly on us because they get the jobs and they get the credit.
No, thank you very much. I think it's a really important point to bring out. And I didn't touch on that a whole lot in here, but I think I was actually really happy to see this student from rhetoric and composition talking about the fact that there is this kind of, I think she was presenting it as more benign in that there's a lack of understanding, but I don't always think it is benign. So I think that exposing the interdisciplinarity by seeing where different aspects of the research, the methods, the outcome comes from is really important because otherwise, yeah, we run the risk of just saying, oh, this is my work, and yeah, it's interdisciplinary, but I don't really talk about what I'm drawing on from these other fields. So I think that's something that we really need to think about. And I think if we can articulate that, then we show what the different fields have to offer and how it is different. Yeah, and I mean, sitting in that workshop on computational rhetoric, I was like, but wait, there's all these other things to think about. But it was an environment where I think people appreciated that I had some expertise in this area. So I think I think having these spaces where we can talk about these issues and talk about this conflict, and especially bringing graduate students into these discussions is really, really good. So
I'm thinking maybe in your diagrams and your conceptualizations, you might want to have a power vector in there, or some, Foucaultian power dispersion or something.
yeah, thank you.
Hi, Shelley.
Hey,
thank you so much for your presentation. Talking about graduate students and interdisciplinarity, I'm teaching a Trends and Methods class this semester in rhetoric. And actually one of my graduate students is here because I suggested your presentation talking about methods and methodologies. Is there a recommendation that you can make, kind of putting you on the spot a little bit, and asking you if there's some guidelines or some recommendations that you can make to students who are just embarking on their research and interdisciplinarity? Could you speak a little bit to that?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think looking for scholars, and so I had the example of the Sylvia and Lucky article where they're really trying to articulate where these disciplinary boundaries are, and yet also think about how the disciplines can work together to achieve common goals. I mean, I don't have another good reference. Maybe somebody else in the audience does. But kind of recognizing as they're reading who is really making those disciplinary boundaries clear, but yet also I think we can do a lot of that, but we can also kind of look for those convergences as well. Yeah. Does anybody have a suggestion?
Well, I was thinking also one of the things that we've, because this is a topic that's very fresh right now in our class, is really talking about the methods that we're using, right? And just being very transparent
Exactly.
About that, and saying exactly what our methods are, and if we are bringing interdisciplinary methods, to give the credit where the credit is due, right?
Yeah, exactly.
And not to just kind of brush it under the rug, and not speak about it. So, and it's a very relevant point right now in conversations going on.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you.
We've got time for just one more question. So if there's anyone who has another question, otherwise.
I also want to thank you for the talk. I think it's really beautiful how you've excavated all these different levels of research, and I feel like I have about 5 questions about interdisciplinarity, but I'm going to ask you a different question than what I had originally, which is, could you just say a little bit about next steps, kind of where the project's going from here?
I'd love to. Yeah, so as you may have seen from our plan for this semester, we're continuing to work on research, and particularly we want to focus on the interdisciplinary research project on citation practices. We're also working on how we're going to articulate the pedagogical artifacts with the papers. We have gotten IRB approval, which, as we all know, takes time, and that was a big hurdle. So we are able to now identify, or connect the artifacts to the papers ethically. And so now we have to figure out how to do that more logistically. We're also applying for a number of grants. Basically, to move this online, we really need to get more funding. So that's really a huge focus for us. And then here at U of A, I am hoping to be collecting new data from the first year writing courses that we have here. There's actually Kara Reed, I don't think she's here, but she's already been doing some data collection. I'm hoping to connect with her and bring her on board with the project. So, thank you.
All right, thank you, Dr. Staples. We'd like to let's give her